can, but I just kind of assumed that, I'd probably die, in my early 50s.
So I'd like to begin by asking, what do you think is the one thing people need to be most aware of when they think about living with HCM?
I guess the thing to be most aware of is that it's a genetic condition in most cases. So you always need to think if someone's diagnosed about family members, because with HCM, there's different aspects of it, symptoms, and some of them are dangerous. So there needs to be a risk assessment because HCM is the most common cause of sudden death in young people. So it's very important that family members are screened. But it's an invisible illness. Looking at somebody, you don't generally know that they have it. And that's very hard for the patient because we often feel unwell or have symptoms, and whoever's looking at us can't see it. Even when I started having arrhythmias when I was a teenager, it took me a very long time to tell my mom. I passed out on the basketball court before I told her. I didn't want to worry her because she had it too, and she was not well.
I suppose that leads me on to my next question. I know you've shared with me that you were 5 years old when you were diagnosed. You've just mentioned there that your mum also lived with HCM and some of your children are also living with HCM. So my question really is, could you share a story with us about how you being diagnosed with HCM has impacted on your family life?
So, I was diagnosed after my mom was diagnosed. So she passed out driving. So there might be a genetic component. So my mom was found to have it. So my brother and I were both brought in to be screened. And I remember it. I actually remember like having an echocardiogram. I even remember the doctor's name. It's very odd, because I, when I think of my 5-year-old self, I didn't really understand the full impact, but there must have been an element of me that knew it was huge because I could see how unwell my mom was. And I didn't want to be unwell like that. But my 5-year-old self felt okay. So I thought, well, maybe it will be different for me. Our family has a very high penetrance. So, I have cousins and my nephew and my son has it. I have 2 daughters who have the gene. I didn't want to, when I was young, I didn't want to be sick. I didn't want someone to tell me I had a heart condition. So that's been really challenging. But I will say that the generational trauma is huge. My mom, she lived with heart failure longer than anybody I know. I remember going to visit my grandfather who had the condition, and we would see him in the hospital, and he just wasted away from heart failure at the age of 54. And I knew I had this condition. So I just thought, well, this will be my fate. I'm never going to live a full life. I'll live as a full life as I can, but I just kind of assumed that, I'd probably die, in my early 50s. And then having children or a child that definitely has it, who has it quite severely, there's guilt. For me in particular, because my child who has it went through a very traumatic myectomy where we nearly lost him because he hemorrhaged and was on dialysis. Like even thinking about that time and walking around, he was at Great Ormond Street in London, when he was brought back into the operating room, like I didn't know where to go. I was, it was early in the morning. No one else was there yet. They didn't know if he was going to make it or not. And just walking around the hallways. And I went and I sat in the clinic because that's where I knew, because that's where he always went, and I was, in my head, I was planning his funeral. I remember apologizing to my son when he was younger. I don't know, maybe he was 8 or so. And he was just like, Mom, don't worry. It was just how things were meant to be. And it's not your fault, and that's his child speaking to a mom who's like upset. And he shouldn't have been having to make me feel better. But I guess that never really goes away. You just kind of learn to live with it. Um, and having children is a choice. And I always wanted children, and I know with HCM, you can have it very mildly or you can have it very severely. And I thought with my family, there's so much penetrance, surely it's time that I just so strongly felt, and maybe it was just magical thinking at the time that my children would be spared.
I was wondering if you would mind sharing with us if there are any ways in which living with HCM has impacted romantic relationships.
So, when you're a young adult, and you look healthy, and maybe you're not having huge serious symptoms, but you know that you don't know what your future holds. It's it's hard because what do you tell a potential partner? At the time when I met my husband now, I had a defibrillator. I had a scar from having a myectomy. And, there's intimacy, and obviously you can't hide things. Um, but it did take me a long time to kind of really express what it meant, because I thought, well, maybe I'll be different. It'll be different for me. Maybe, just maybe. Maybe my future's not going to be like my grandfather's or my mom's. When I went into heart failure and went through transplant, that's a whole nother dimension of impact on relationships. They go through a lot of trauma as well. It's almost like, I think it's almost easier to be the patient. That sounds crazy, but when I think of, I don't know, when I think of when I was being wheeled into the operating room and saying goodbye to my husband, and it was the first time I really saw him like break down. So yeah, it has a huge impact on relationships. And I have friends that, um, have not been able to get a hold of me. I remember when I was in heart failure and would be hysterical when they did, because they thought I was dead or something happened to me.
And you mentioned friendships there, and how you've noticed that behaviour change in some of your friends. What about your social life? How has HCM impacted on your social life and your ability to, you mentioned exercise, but hobbies and fatigue,
Yeah.
and how has that been?
I mean, it's been very different depending on what stage I've been in at life. And I would say, like I remember my college days, I was, a little wild and rebellious. There, were times that maybe I drank too much and got a little too dehydrated. I'd become unwell, and I'd have to next day, I wouldn't be able to do anything, or I'd have to say no to things. And I would never really say why. I'd make up other excuses because I didn't want people to think I was sick or I had this condition. Sometimes I would get dizzy with arrhythmias, so I would say no to things. And um, that was hard. And then going through after that, the transplant process, that's a whole different thing, because I will say that there are certain people who have been with me ride or die through it all. And there are other friends that are good friends that have kind of drifted away. And it's almost like, I have to be careful now because I take immunosuppression, so that prevents rejection of my heart. So especially during COVID, it's like I couldn't really do anything. And even now I have to be careful, like especially around, the holiday season, but everyone's inside and, there's a lot of germs going around. And I've had dear friends who are just like, can't get their head around that, or just, I'm not funny me anymore. And it's not because I don't want to do it. It's because I want to be here for my family and be safe, because I tend to end up in the hospital when I get sick. Yeah. And I've even had a friend who's actually a formal medical professional who's like, who's kind of given me a hard time. And, it's been like, do you need to see so many healthcare professionals? And I'm like, I wish I didn't. I really do not enjoy having to go, like even now, because although I've had a transplant post, from HCM, it never ends. You're in constantly being monitored, and it's that to me, it like actually broke my heart because it's such a dear friend that had been with me through so much. And I was like, can you not see how hard this is?
Amy, would you mind sharing with us how or if HCM has impacted on your career and your work life in any way?
Absolutely. So it definitely has. Like, so I was a midwife for many years. Even to train, I had to go through a long process of like, is she going to be able to do this with this heart with HCM? And I did get the approval. But then once I started becoming, once I was a midwife and I was up and working, it was really challenging because when I would do night shifts, I would get so symptomatic. And having to still being new at a job and approach your manager and say, hey, I have this condition and this is what's happening. They were always very understanding, but you still feel like you're letting your colleagues down. Um, Especially, when I became more experienced and I was often managing an area, that was really challenging. And then post-transplant, it's been really hard. It's been really hard to get back into like a full-time job. So HCM definitely has affected my work life in many ways,
Yeah.
both pre and post-transplant. Although being a midwife working in a really busy hospital was very challenging. It was one of the greatest honors of my life to do that. And it's been very hard for me to come to terms with the fact that I'm not going to be doing that again. Growing up with a chronic illness and having a mom with a chronic illness, I worked in high risk and I loved the women with the problems. That was my thing. Because I had so much empathy for it and I didn't dismiss what people were saying. Like because I know what it's like.
My final question for you, and you did kind of touch on it a little bit, was around mental health. Would you mind sharing with us your experiences of living with HCM and the impact on your emotional well-being?
Having this invisible illness, it did have an impact on my mental health. When I look back at my adolescent teenage years, I was depressed. I didn't have seek treatment. I didn't tell my parents, but I know I went through deep periods of depression. And going forward, it was in my third pregnancy when I, became very unwell and was having very dangerous arrhythmias and had developed obstruction, the fear that I could drop dead, because they weren't going to do anything while I was pregnant, and also my mom passed away when I was 7 months pregnant post-transplant. So it was like this whole big, crazy, awful time. That had a huge impact on my mental health. So following my mom passing, I spent a month in the hospital waiting to give birth, had a baby. Within 6 months, had a myectomy, open heart surgery. Then within, I don't know, another 6 months to a year, I had a defibrillator implanted. It's a lot, and it's a lot to get used to. And I think around that time, I did start seeing a therapist. It's just learning strategies to cope and, deal with, how to look after yourself mentally and physically and trying to find that balance. And that's been a lifelong struggle with HCM. There's been tremendous grief and fear and anxiety. And I definitely, I have complex PTSD from all the medicalization and all the things I've seen in family members. Yeah, and going through heart transplant, that's a whole nother, you know, it's odd. It's a strange thing to go through and it's hard. And in a way, I miss my old heart and I'm so grateful. I wouldn't be here if I had my old heart, but it's a strange thing because you kind of think of your heart as being like your center of your emotions and everything. So it's a lot to go through. So I do a lot of proactive things to look after my mental health. And I don't apologize for when I need to take a step back. So yeah, it's a lifelong struggle.